Hello, and welcome to Brief Encounters. My name is Austin A.B. I'm a partner at Ackerman LLP and one of the steering committee co-chairs of the D.C. Bar's D.C. Affairs Community. The D.C. Affairs Community serves our legal community and follows legal and political issues affecting the District of Columbia. Today, we're going to talk about two important events in D.C. history and D.C. Black history, the development of Chevy Chase and Fort Reno Park. I am fortunate to be joined today by Commissioner Ted Trabue from DC's Public Service Commission. Commissioner Trabue is a fourth-generation Washingtonian, and like his mother and grandmother, he attended District of Columbia Public Schools. He received a degree in economics from Dartmouth College and holds a law degree from Howard University School of Law. He has served the district in many capacities over the year, including as the managing director of the DC Sustainable Energy Utility, as the Vice President for DC Affairs at PEPCO, as Staff Director for Critical Issues for the DC and Maryland at the Greater Washington Board of Trade, and as Chief of Staff for former DC City Council Chair Linda Croft. Commissioner Trabue also served on the District of Columbia State Board of Education for more than 5 years. Good afternoon, Commissioner, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Austin. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Before we dive into our topic, I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about the DC Public Service Commission and the work that you're currently doing, which is tied to what we're talking about, but a little bit different.
Thank you. The DC Public Service Commission is one of the older organizations in the city. We were established in 1913 to regulate the gas company, Washington Gas, the electric company, of course, PEPCO. And back then, there were a lot of telecommunications issues involved as well. But today, the commission really focuses on matters involving the electric and gas utility, making sure that our residents and businesses receive safe, affordable, and reliable services from our utilities, as well as ensuring the financial health of these companies that are headquartered and doing business here and are large employers in the city. We also have a new goal that the City Council added to our agenda about 5 years ago, and that's making sure that our utilities help the city hit its long-term climate agenda. And so we work very closely with the utilities to make sure that they are moving in positive directions to help the city hit its long-term climate goals. So I'm a commissioner here at the commission. There are 3 of us, all appointed by the mayor and confirmed by the council to 4-year terms at the commission. And so I've been here for a little over 2 years now.
That's wonderful. Thank you for all your good work at the DC Public Service Commission and for your previous service and all the different roles within the DC community. Before we dive into the topic, I want to give it a little bit more, get a little bit better sense of your unique position as a fourth generation native Washingtonian. So easy question first. Where did you grow up in the city and what schools did you go to?
In my very early years, up until the end of 3rd grade, I grew up right around the intersection of Georgia Avenue and Piney Branch Road. I attended Tacoma Elementary School over there from kindergarten through the 3rd grade. After Dr. King was assassinated in 1968, and some of the restrictive covenants on houses that forbade the sale to African Americans, after those were kind of lifted or ignored, quite frankly. Starting in about 1969, my parents moved us to a house that is in Chevy Chase, about 2 blocks from St. John's High School. I started attending in the 4th grade Murch Elementary School, did a year at Deal, and then went to St. John's. And as you kind of said in my bio, after St. John's High School, I went to Dartmouth College and Howard University School of Law. But I've lived in the district for my entire lifetime, spending, again, the first few years just off of Georgia Avenue and the balance of that time in the home that my parents purchased in Chevy Chase.
So you really are part of the fabric of the neighborhoods that we're going to be talking about here, and perhaps a little more modern experience with them than what we're going to talk about, but
yes, indeed.
Fascinating to hear the continuing evolution of these neighborhoods. So I'm especially excited to have you here to talk about this area of DC because it's literally a stone's throw from me. Fort Reno Park is a park that my daughter walks through on her way to Alice Deal Middle School. Chevy Chase is right around the corner. Today, most of the park, the Fort Reno Park, is owned by the National Park Service. It includes a community garden, a baseball field, several tennis courts, a large reservoir facility operated by DC Water. Obviously, the Alice Deal Middle School is right there adjacent to the park. And there are large expanses of grass within the park with a bandstand that has hosted an annual DIY concert series that has been important to DC's music scene, particularly the DC punk community. Shout out to Fugazi. But prior to the Civil War, this land was literally a farm. And it's hard to imagine, given the way the community is developed today, the idea of farmland. So, Commissioner, can you take us back to about the 1850s when the area was a private farm named Oak Lawn?
Sure, sure. If we want to wind the clock back about 175 years, the District of Columbia at the time was still a relatively small town in terms of population. The total population barely exceeded 50,000. You had about 38,000 whites who were here, 10,000 freed blacks, and about 3,700 enslaved individuals, just topping about 50,000 persons. And quite frankly, the northern edge of the densely populated area in town was DuPont Circle, if you were coming north out of the core of downtown. So as you came up, which did not exist at the time, which is now Connecticut Avenue, straight from DuPont Circle, it was really just woods. The trail going north and south at the time, going all the way from Georgetown up into Rockville and Gaithersburg, was what we now call Wisconsin Avenue, was a path that runs along the ridge line, but that's Wisconsin Avenue, Rockville Pike, and that's how people went north and south back at the time. This farm, as you mentioned, that was owned by a family named the Dwyers, was located in the area, if you just name the streets, Wisconsin Avenue to the west, Nebraska Avenue to the east, between Chesapeake and Fessenden Streets. And on the top of the farm was the highest geographical point in the city. As you can imagine, the highest geographical point in the city leads to unfettered views going out to the west all the way over to Arlington, going north all the way up Wisconsin Avenue into Maryland. It's about a 70-acre farm that the Dwyers owned, again, with the highest geographical point in the city. So when the Civil War breaks out in 1861, the military, in order to protect the nation's capital, builds a series of about 68 forts and 93 batteries with over 800 cannons to circle the core of downtown. So these defense systems are built all around, encircling the city. And at this highest point, which is the farm owned by the Dwyers, the military comes in and says, look, we're going to use this farm as a military post or a fort. And so a troop from Pennsylvania actually built it. It was called Fort Pennsylvania at the time. It was later named after Reno was a general who died during the Civil War. But because the views that were offered at this highest geographical point were very, very important on this 70-acre farm, the land is taken and the military turns it into a fort. And so, as I said, this is located just about 2 blocks off of Wisconsin Avenue. The fort is built, the supplies are there, the cannons are there and everything. And on a hot summer day in July, the Confederate troops, this is the only time that there was actually a battle within the borders, as we understand them, of the District of Columbia. The Confederate troops start coming down about Rockville Pike. They're up in the Bethesda area. They're spotted by the individuals within Fort Reno, and they unleash the cannons on them. Coming under fire, the Confederates swung over to the east and decided to try to attack the city from there. And so the Union soldiers then encountered Confederate soldiers over at Fort Stevens, which is, as you know, not quite as far east as Georgia Avenue, but about 4 miles east of Fort Reno. So they were coming into to Fort Stevens, where a battle ensues. President Lincoln at the time, who was at his summer cottage at the old soldiers' home only about 2 miles away, hears that there's a battle going on. He decides to go up to Fort Stevens and get a better look at the battle. He's behind one of the buttresses, but decides to poke his head up to take a better look at what's going on. And as you can imagine, at 6'4", 6'6", President Lincoln was the tallest president we ever had. Wearing this large stovepipe hat, he makes quite an easy target. Shots ring out. Story has it a bullet goes through Lincoln's hat, doesn't hit Lincoln himself, but does strike an Army surgeon who was standing, very, very close to Lincoln at the time. At the point, they said it was Oliver Wendell Holmes was actually there, told Lincoln to, get his derriere down so that he didn't get shot. But fast forward, the war's over. The fort is no longer being used for a military base, and it's returned to the Dyer family. And Mr. Dyer had passed away, and Mrs. Dyer decided to subdivide the property and sell it. Again, you're talking about, just wilderness, basically. Big farm, and next door, over, to the east a little bit, where we'll talk about Chevy Chase in a minute. It's just woodland, and so she decides after some legal challenges to sell and break the property into small, affordable home sites. Between 600 to 1,000 of these home sites are offered about 2,500 square feet apiece, and even by today's standards, that's pretty small. Half the lots were advertised for sale for the very, very modest sum of $12.50, even at the time. Affordable. A lot of African Americans jump at the opportunity to start building on these home sites. And Reno City, as it's advertised, starts to become a large African American development in this northern and western part of town, which is now Fort Reno Friendship Heights, as many people know the community. And so by 1872, first Black church goes up within the community of Reno City, as it's called. Reno City grows, flourishes. By 1903, a school for Black children is built on what is now basically the grounds where Deal Middle School sits. So you get to about 1903 or so, and you've got this very flourishing African American community. But a mile or so to the east, in this deeply wooded area, you had a different sort of a movement going on. A man by the name of Francis Newlands, who was a congressman from the state of Nevada, later becomes a senator, comes to the District of Columbia, representing the state of Nevada, and comes here with an immense amount of wealth. Newlands is the heir to something called the Comstock Lode, not L-O-A-D, L-O-D-E, the Comstock Lode. For those of you who are not numismatist coin collectors, as I am, let me kind of break it down for a second. In 1849, gold was discovered in California, and of course, creating the California Gold Rush. In 1859, silver was discovered in Nevada, creating a similar rush. Senator Newland's family owned the property on which many of the silver mines, the largest one of them being the Comstock Lode, were discovered. Man comes here immensely wealthy, having, this money from the silver mines. And the silver that was used to mint the silver dollars, the half dollars, the quarters and dimes that were made out of 90% silver up until 1964. I mean, so this man is, extremely wealthy, comes to the city and starts buying up property going north from DuPont Circle, drawing a straight line up to what is now Chevy Chase Circle. And he starts buying up property. He buys up 1,700 acres, all the way up, going north into Maryland up to Jones Bridge Road. And then he starts developing the lands that he has purchased to be a new neighborhood exclusively for wealthy, probably white, more than likely white individuals. He establishes the Chevy Chase Land Company, which requires a couple of things of these new housing sites that they're going to sell. First, that they would be single family detached homes with fairly sizable lots. The lots would cost a large amount of money. being constructed. As we said, you've got these houses going up and these lots being sold over in Fort Reno. In that neighborhood, they're going for $12.50 a lot. Newlands and the Chevy Chase Land Company set a minimum price of $3,000 per lot for the lots that were along the side streets, and $5,000 at a minimum for lots that would be sold up and down on Connecticut Avenue. You can see the great disparity that's already coming into existence. Newland also convinces Congress to build an extension of the streetcar to come up Connecticut Avenue to connect his new community to the downtown District of Columbia community. Newlands and the Chevy Chase Land Company also start building amenities to attract residents to come up to his new and burgeoning community. They build a man-made lake, which is called Chevy Chase Lake, which still was in existence into the mid-70s or so. He built a country club, which is now Chevy Chase Country Club, going strong. Today, he builds an amusement park, builds a hotel up there. The hotel ultimately failed, but he builds a hotel and all sorts of amenities to really make this a very, very nice place for his new wealthy residents in this community. Parenthetically, around 1906 or so, some African Americans tried to buy some land that was adjacent to Chevy Chase, and they used white individuals as kind of straw men to go and buy the properties up there and buy the lots and then sell them back to African Americans. Newlands got wind of this, had all of the deeds canceled and everything. About 20 of them had been sold, but he quashed that. But Newlands is getting pressure from the residents of Chevy Chase that, they want space for a school for white children, and they want a park, and they want these poor African Americans out. And so the Chevy Chase Land Company starts purchasing homes within Fort Reno, and then Newlands ultimately goes to the city's planning commission to get the city to take by eminent domain some of the lots that remain, some of the people that didn't want to sell. They have to understand the form of government that the District of Columbia had at the time. From 1873 until 1975, when we got this limited form of home rule that exists today, the city operated under what we called a commissioner form of government. There were three presidentially appointed commissioners who essentially ran the district government. Newlands, a United States senator at the time, clearly has entree to speak with these commissioners and persuades them, despite the fact that a hearing was held on Capitol Hill and you had this rare opportunity where African Americans were actually allowed to testify in front of Congress, to go down, and they objected to the fact that the government was about to take their land. They opposed this vehemently, of course. But ultimately, by the mid-20s, federal government decides to buy the remaining homes and evict the African Americans from Fort Reno. By the 30s, all of the land was taken and cleared, except for the school that had been built for the African American children. Deal Middle School is erected and built right next to the school for African American children, which was shut down. And then the large park that you described earlier in the presentation was created that now has the tennis courts. I think Wilson's baseball field is there. There's the area where they have the concerts and the stage that's there. It's quite a large area that is built. By the 30s, 1935, Deal opens. Deal today, Deal has always been considered probably the best middle school in the District of Columbia. It's a huge school. Deal is the second largest public middle school on the Eastern Seaboard, next to another middle school up in Pennsylvania, but it's the largest on the Eastern Seaboard and has a list of very prominent graduates. Warren Buffett is a graduate of Deal. Councilmember Janice Lewis George. I know we're here with the D.C. Bar Association today. Former Attorney General Carl Racine went to Deal. I got to talk about Carl for a minute because when I started at Murch in the fourth grade, Carl was 2 years younger than I am. And so Carl was in second grade. Carl's sister, Mikhail, was in my class, and we've remained friends, since the late 60s for all of these years. I did not get to graduate from Deal. I left there early to go over to St. John's, but I did get to work there as a janitor back in the 70s when I had one of my first jobs with the district government. You also saw, flipping back a minute to to the Civil War in that area, the construction of Military Road. And Military Road was built by the Army to connect all of these forts and get the supplies and ammunitions back and forth. Military Road connects Fort Reno on the westernmost end, Fort Stevens, as we talked about, when the Confederate troops swooped over to the east and came down to attack the city from that direction, all the way over to Fort Hutton, which is along the metro. So you have this, if you know the roads back and forth in the district, you know Military Road, and that's why it's called Military Road, because the military built it with their supplies and their armaments. But the sad, ending to the story is that you had this thriving African American community in upper Northwest Washington, pushed out by eminent domain largely, and you had a community that was built, and then restrictive covenants on the homes started to go in place in the 1920s, such that the homes were not allowed to be sold to African Americans, and in some cases, not allowed to be sold to Jews. Some people would argue that Chevy Chase remains one of the least integrated parts of the District of Columbia, particularly on the Maryland side of it. Chevy Chase, of course, straddles the District of Columbia and the southernmost parts of Montgomery County, some of the least integrated neighborhoods that we have in the city even today. But with that, I want to wrap it up. I want to thank you for allowing me to talk a little about these two very, very important communities in our city, and would be happy to answer, a couple of questions if you may have some.
That was absolutely fascinating. And it's so interesting to me in part because, as I mentioned, I do live here in the neighborhood next door. And then thinking about Military Road is the road that I drive my son to school. My daughters would take them to orchestra rehearsal at Tacoma Elementary School, where you started in elementary. And it's just fascinating. I mean, we think about this as kind of ancient history. We start talking about the Civil War, and it feels like so long ago. But something that you had mentioned previously was like the last piece of Fort Reno Park was only condemned and demolished in the 1950s. Is that right?
I believe that's correct. Yeah, I believe that's correct. And I think there are 3 or 4 homes along Nebraska Avenue that were not, that remained, that were not demolished. But yeah, I mean, I drove by there, in fact, over the weekend as my wife and I were going over to Wisconsin Avenue. And yeah, in any remnants whatsoever of the community that existed back in the late 1800s to early 1900s is gone.
Yeah, just gone. And yet there are those little markers you mentioned. The Reno School, which has now been integrated into the Alice Deal Middle School.
Right. Reno School stood there kind of empty. It was used as kind of overflow office space. It was not used for educational purposes for years and years and years. And then when Deal was renovated, a decade or so ago, yeah, they renovated the old school and integrated it into Deal. Both of my children went to Deal. I'm very proud to say my son just graduated from Jackson Reed about a year ago. And Deal remains just a wonderful, wonderful school today, but it's a sad history that caused its location where it is.
Yeah, and then I mean, again, highlighting the sad history, we have the situation of Chevy Chase Country Club, as you mentioned, the questions of integration of the Chevy Chase neighborhood. Obviously, I think the city is incredibly proud of Alice Deal Middle School, but it's not a great origin story as the kind of excuse or one of the excuses that was used to clear out a thriving Black neighborhood. I want to highlight another piece before we wrap up. None of this would have been possible without financing, without the bankers. And a big part of that was Riggs Bank and the president of Riggs Bank, which was obviously at that time kind of interwoven with the whole political environment. I think I saw a reference to the idea that presidents bank there and most of Congress bank there. But your family actually has a relationship with Riggs Bank as well. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, the Riggs family were very, very good to my family. My great grandmother was the housekeeper for Mr. and Ms. Riggs. This goes back to the late 1800s. They helped my grandmother purchase the first home that we owned as a family here in the District of Columbia. That house was in Leroy Park at about the corner of 2nd and V Northwest. And my grandmother lived there until she died about 15 years ago. But the Riggs family is very interesting because my great grandmother worked there for years. When they passed away, they did not leave her any money. But the Riggs children said, well, we're cleaning out the house. If you guys want the furniture, you can have it. And so we have these just marvelous antiques all throughout our family homes here in the District of Columbia that came from the Riggs home, the Riggs of Riggs National Bank. So I have that connection with the Riggs. I've got some of their furniture in my house, and believe me, they had some very nice furniture.
I'm sure.
I've been the fortunate, recipient of as it's been passed down through the generations.
Well, it's just amazing to think that, in one way, the history has sort of been vanished. There's very little traces of what Reno City would have been like, other than looking back to some of the pictures I know that have been saved and hearing stories like yours. But at the same time, those little clues, the furniture in people's houses and the history of where the Reno school came from and the Alice Steele background, those little clues to history are there if we look for them and know the stories.
If you really want to take a look to see what Chevy Chase looked like as it was really starting to get built around 1910, 1915, if you're on Connecticut Avenue on the DC side, go east off of Connecticut Avenue onto Morrison Street. The homes there, it's just south of the Safeway that's there on Connecticut Avenue. The homes there were Sears and Roebuck homes, and many of them have just been restored impeccably. They are masterpieces.
Well, there we go. A little field trip, everyone. Don't disturb the residents, but for a little trip back in history, go for a nice walk once the weather's nice and you're ready for a stroll. Commissioner Trabue, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for sharing this fascinating history of both the neighborhoods and your own family's part in the history. We really appreciate you sharing.
Thank you very much, Austin. And for those of you who are listening today, so much appreciated. And the work that you do here in the city is so important to the protection of our city. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. And as a reminder to folks listening, if you are interested in this kind of local history or issues related to DC home rule and statehood, I would encourage you to join the DC Affairs community of the DC Bar. Please reach out to me or the bar, and we will get you the information for our new monthly meeting every noon on the second Friday of each month. On behalf of the DC Affairs community, thank you again to Commissioner Trabue, and thanks for listening. Take care.